Imagine working 40 years for a pension that eventually couldn't buy 3 grams of gold, but only 3 individual atoms. While hyperinflation turned István Kovács's life savings into arithmetic ghosts, it transformed a debt-heavy merchant into the wealthiest man in Budapest by incinerating his crushing loans. This one hidden mechanism reveals the brutal truth of finance. Inflation is a violent redistribution of wealth that systematically rewards the bold debtor while ruining the faithful saver. By the autumn of 1946, the streets of Budapest had become a laboratory for the most violent economic experiment in human history. István Kovács, a man who had spent 40 years meticulously designing the infrastructure of his country as a civil engineer, found that the bridge to his own retirement had collapsed. He had been a model of fiscal responsibility, contributing faithfully to a state retirement fund that promised dignity. Yet, when he received his monthly payment that October, the mathematical reality was haunting. Only 6 months prior, that same check could have sustained his entire family for a full week. Now, after the Hungarian pengo began its descent into a terminal coma, his entire monthly pension, when converted to a stable store of value, was worth exactly 3 individual atoms of gold. Not 3 grams, or even 3 flecks, but 3 subatomic particles of wealth. This was the dying in real time of a national currency. At its terrifying peak, prices in Hungary were doubling every 15 hours, a pace so aggressive that it rendered the very concept of change obsolete. Shopkeepers in the city center eventually refused to provide coins to customers, knowing that in the mere seconds it took a person to walk from the wooden counter to the street exit, the metal in their hand would have already withered in purchasing power. However, the chaos was not a universal eraser of fortune, it was a redistributor. While István watched his life's work evaporate, a textile merchant named Laszlo Berger was navigating the same streets with predatory success. In 1944, Laszlo Berger had taken a massive gamble, borrowing heavily to stock his factories with high-end machinery. At the time, his debt was a suffocating weight that threatened his bankruptcy. But by 1946, a miraculous inversion occurred. The nominal figures on the bank's ledgers remained frozen in time, while the value of the money used to pay them vanished. He eventually cleared debts that were originally equivalent to the value of a lush city block using a handful of currency that couldn't settle the bill for a single loaf of bread. His physical assets, the iron, the looms, and the bricks, retained their intrinsic worth, while his liabilities were bleached into transparent vapor. This recurring historical phenomenon forces us to ask how such a total shift in the balance of power between the cautious saver and the aggressive borrower is even possible. The core of this financial magic trick lies in the nature of the contract itself, which is strictly written in nominal terms. Whether the agreement specifies dollars, marks, or pounds, the number on the paper remains fixed while the purchasing power of those units floats on a sea of economic volatility. When a borrower signs on the dotted line, they are agreeing to return a specific count of currency, not a specific standard of living or a set quantity of goods. This distinction often feels like a technical footnote until inflation enters the room, at which point it becomes the brutal dividing line between total financial ruin and absolute survival. Consider the landscape of the United States between 1970 and 1980, a decade where inflation averaged over 7% annually and occasionally surged past a staggering 13%. A farmer who borrowed $10,000 in 1970 to upgrade his equipment provides the perfect case study. By 1980, the nominal sum he owed was still $10,000. But the real weight of that obligation had been sliced nearly in half. While the prices of his land, his tractors, and the very crops he hauled to market climbed alongside the general price index, his debt remained perfectly preserved in the cheaper currency values of a bygone era. He was effectively settling his accounts with ghost money, currency that looked the same on a ledger but carried only a fraction of its original gravitational pull. This fundamental asymmetry reveals why inflation acts as a silent benefactor for the deeply indebted. The debtor locks in their obligation at the precise moment the contract is signed, but their income, whether derived from corporate profits, hourly wages, or soaring asset values, tends to drift upward with the tide of rising prices. We see this play out most clearly with a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. In the early years of the loan, a homeowner might find that their monthly payment consumes a substantial 25% of their take-home pay. However, If inflation runs hot, her salary naturally climbs and the market value of her home follows suit, while that mortgage payment remains a frozen monument to the past. By year 15, in an inflationary environment, that same payment might represent only 15% of her income. This transformation isn't the result of professional cleverness or a sudden burst of hard work. It is the simple, mathematical erosion of money's value over the long arc of time. One must ask how the mere passage of years can turn a once-crushing financial burden into a negligible line item on a monthly budget. While the debtor celebrates, the lender is forced to swallow a bitter pill, receiving back currency that possesses significantly less utility than the capital originally provided. This wealth destruction becomes an absolute mathematical certainty whenever the interest rate on a loan fails to outpace the speed of rising prices. Far from being a mere academic theory, this precise scenario devastated millions of American mortgage holders during the 1970s, facilitating a colossal migration of real value from the pockets of creditors into the hands of debtors. To grasp the severity of this shift, one must look at the real interest rate, the actual yield calculated by subtracting inflation from the nominal rate. This figure represents the true change in a lender's command over the physical world. In the late 1970s, American savings accounts typically offered nominal returns of 5% or 6%. While that might appear reasonable on a bank statement, it was a financial mirage compared to inflation rates ranging between 10% and 12%. In this environment, savers were hemorrhaging 4% to 6% of their purchasing power every single year, even as they collected interest. Borrowers with fixed-rate obligations found themselves in a mirror world of negative real interest rates, where the money they owed was losing its potency faster than interest could accrue. During this era, it was as if the banks were serving as a leaky bucket, where the water of capital drained away so rapidly that the institution was effectively bribing the borrower to carry the vessel. Governments have historically been the most sophisticated players in this game. Following World War II, the United States was saddled with a debt-to-GDP ratio exceeding 100%, a weight many economists feared would paralyze post-war prosperity. However, from 1946 to 1970, the state employed a strategy of financial repression, deliberately pinning interest rates at artificial lows while allowing a steady, modest inflation to persist. This allowed the government to slowly dissolve the real value of its obligations. The nominal debt figures remained massive, but as the economy expanded and prices rose, the relative gravity of that debt began to fade. The citizens who had patriotically bought war bonds found their returns quietly harvested by inflation, a process that functioned as a ghost fleece, subtly shearing wealth from private creditors to provide the state with a clean slate. One must wonder at the cold irony of a system where a citizen's loyal investment is transformed into a silent levy through nothing more than the steady debasement of the medium of exchange. The third pillar of this wealth redistribution involves the way inflation manipulates collateral and asset values to the compounding benefit of the borrower. When a homeowner signs a mortgage, the underlying property acts as security for the bank, yet the market value of that asset is never truly locked in. In an inflationary cycle, tangible assets, land, industrial buildings, and essential commodities frequently experience a surge in nominal price. This happens even if the physical utility or intrinsic quality of the asset remains entirely unchanged. We saw this dynamic reach a fever pitch in the American Midwest during the 1970s. As global demand intertwined with rampant inflation, the prices of grain skyrocketed, pulling farmland values upward along with them. A farmer who had leveraged his acreage in 1970 discovered by 1980 that his property's nominal worth had doubled or even tripled. Remarkably, his debt remained a static figure from the past. His equity position didn't just grow, it exploded, all without him ever contributing a single dollar beyond his original repayment schedule. In the cold language of the balance sheet, his debt-to-asset ratio improved simply because the foundation of his net worth expanded like rising dough while his liabilities stayed the same size. While banks received every scheduled payment, the purchasing power of that principal and interest was being eaten away by monetary depreciation. This creates a perfect formula for automatic wealth, owning an appreciating asset that is financed by a depreciating obligation. This specific pattern is not unique to the United States. It has echoed through history, from the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany to the modern economic landscape of Turkey. In these environments, property owners with mortgages watch their net worth climb a mountain, while those living on fixed incomes or traditional savings watch their purchasing power fall off a cliff. Beyond the math, there is a psychological shift that economic models rarely capture. One must wonder if inflation is actually a hidden engine that forcefully shifts wealth from those who patiently wait to those who boldly act. This environment creates a frantic sense of urgency, moving the incentive structure away from long-term saving and toward borrowing and spending immediately. A business owner watching their input costs climb has every rational incentive to borrow today to secure inventory or equipment that will inevitably carry a steeper price tag tomorrow. By securing a fixed-rate loan, she essentially freezes current prices into her books, while knowing that her repayments will be settled using the diluted value of future money. This strategy acts like a financial wind at her back, propelling her forward while those who stubbornly cling to traditional saving and lending watch their purchasing power slowly bleed out. It is a self-reinforcing cycle. As more actors recognize this pattern, they borrow with increasing aggression, further accelerating the divide between the debt-leveraged winner and the cash-heavy loser. This psychological shift extends deep into the gritty reality of negotiations and defaults. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of a high-inflation environment is how a struggling debtor can actually find themselves holding more cards than the bank that funded them. As the calendar turns, the real value of the outstanding debt is relentlessly eaten away by the tide of rising prices. Lenders, realizing that time is a predator working exclusively for the borrower, often become remarkably flexible. They would rather renegotiate terms or accept a smaller, immediate slice of the pie than undergo a lengthy foreclosure process only to receive a pile of currency that has lost half its potency. This specific dynamic defined the landscape across Latin America during the high inflation decades of the 1980s and 1990s. In that era, debtors routinely forced banks to the table because the alternative was receiving a settlement in a currency that could lose 50% of its worth within a single year. The combination of fixed nominal obligations meeting rising nominal incomes, negative real interest rates, soaring collateral values against frozen debt, and these shifted behavioral incentives creates a profound transformation. In this crucible, being deeply in debt ceases to be a position of vulnerability and instead becomes a fortress of advantage. This is not a moral judgment or a commentary on character, but a cold, mathematical reality of how debt contracts are structured. We see this with haunting clarity in the German hyperinflation of the early 1920s, which essentially deleted an entire class of bondholders and savers, while leaving debt-financed industrialists standing virtually unscathed. This structural advantage is most potent at the sovereign level, as governments remain the ultimate heavyweight debtors in nearly every global economy. They possess the unique ability to settle astronomical obligations using currency they print and regulate themselves. This reality creates a siren song for the state, a persistent urge for heavily burdened regimes to permit or even stoke currency debasement. It operates as a master key for a locked treasury, serving as a backdoor bankruptcy that bypasses the need for dramatic public declarations or messy legal restructuring. Instead, the state simply leans on the silent friction of diminishing value to wear away its liabilities. The tragic duality of István Kovács and Laszlo Berger in Budapest, alongside the parallel fates of Maria Holzer and Friedrich Kupp in Berlin, serves as a microcosm for millions of lives spanning centuries. For these individuals, financial survival was often decided by the sheer coin toss of whether they stood on the asset side or the liability side of the ledger. While economic textbooks treat these shifts as abstract data points, those who lived through them understood a visceral truth. Inflation is never neutral. It is a force of redistribution as aggressive and absolute as any direct confiscation of property. The wealth flows through a predetermined pipeline, moving relentlessly from the creditor to the debtor and from the patient saver to the aggressive borrower. As we witness a new era of massive debt accumulation and unconventional monetary policy, one must decide whether they would rather be the hand that lends or the hand that borrows.